All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something I think is super relevant to, well, pretty much anyone working in IT these days.
Oh, absolutely.
How do we keep things secure? How do we actually manage access in the cloud?
Yeah,
It's not like the old days where you could just, build a bigger wall around your data center and call it a day.
right, exactly. And that's where, this whole idea of identity as the new perimeter comes in.
You sent over some really interesting stuff about Azure AD privileged identity management.
Yeah,
So let's jump into that. But first, we've got to talk about the big picture here. This whole shift to zero trust.
right.
I mean, slide 2. Understanding the zero trust model. This is like a fundamental change in how we think about security.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most striking things about it is that it starts from this assumption of assume breach.
Assume breach.
Yeah, like assume that somebody's already inside your network,
Okay.
and then you have to verify explicitly every single access attempt.
So it's not just about keeping people out.
No, it's about assuming they might already be in.
I see. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like airport security.
Exactly.
You get through the first checkpoint doesn't mean you're on the plane.
Right. You've got to show your ID and your boarding pass multiple times.
Right, right. So, okay, assume breach is one part of it.
Yeah.
But the material you sent over also talks about 3 key principles of zero trust.
Right.
So first one, verify explicitly.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in practice?
So it means you're not just relying on, a username and password anymore.
Right.
It's about using every piece of information you have
Okay.
to make sure that the person or the device requesting access is actually who they say they are.
Got it. So like multi-factor authentication.
Exactly. Device health checks, user location, the time of day even, and also the sensitivity of the resource.
Oh, that makes sense.
The more sensitive it is, the more stringent your verification needs to be.
Right. Like you wouldn't need the same level of security to access, I don't know, the company cafeteria menu
Right.
as you would to access like financial records.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's verify explicitly. The second principle, least privileged access.
Right. This is a big one.
This is where that idea of just in time, just enough access comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the analogy that really clicks for me here is the idea of like borrowing a tool.
Oh, yeah, I like that one.
You don't need access to the whole toolbox all the time.
Right. You just need the specific screwdriver for the specific screw you're trying to fix.
Exactly. So how does that apply to, user accounts and permissions and all that?
Well, it means that instead of giving people broad standing access to everything, you only grant them the permissions they need for the specific task they need to do,
Okay.
and only for as long as they need it.
So it's like instead of giving someone a key to the executive washroom, they get a temporary code.
Exactly. A code that expires after their meeting.
And then it's gone.
Right. And that really limits the potential for damage if something goes wrong.
Okay, so we've got verify explicitly, we've got least privileged access,
Yep.
and then the third one, assume breach. That sounds a little pessimistic, maybe.
It does, but it's really about being realistic.
Okay.
Like it's probably going to happen at some point.
Right.
So you need to be prepared.
So what does that mean in practice? Like, how do you assume breach?
It means you design your systems and your security policies with the idea that an attacker might already be inside.
Okay.
So you focus on things like network segmentation,
Okay.
strong encryption, and again, limiting those permissions.
Okay.
So if one area is compromised, the damage is contained.
It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of an analogy, like compartments on a submarine.
That's a good one.
If one compartment floods, the whole ship doesn't sink.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the zero trust philosophy.
Yep.
But how do we actually put it into practice? Like, how does Microsoft approach this?
Well, they've got a whole suite of tools that work together. Slide 3. Zero Trust Architecture Components lays it out pretty well.
Okay, so let's talk about those components.
All right, so first you've got Intune,
Intune, right?
which is all about managing your devices,
Okay.
making sure they're configured securely, setting policies.
So it's like the rule book for devices.
Exactly.
Right.
Then you have Azure AD Conditional Access, which is like the gatekeeper.
Okay.
It checks every access request against those rules you set in Intune.
Got it.
And it looks at things like, is the device healthy? Is the user in the right location?
So it's like a health check for the device before it can even get in.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, and then there's Azure ID.
Right, which is basically the master list of all your users and devices.
Okay.
Keeps track of who's who and what's what.
So when someone tries to access something, like, how does the whole process work?
So imagine a user is trying to access some sensitive data.
Mm.
First, Intune has already made sure their device is following all the security rules.
Okay.
Then their device reports back to Azure AD saying, hey, I'm healthy, I'm compliant.
Okay.
And then Azure AD Conditional Access steps in and says, okay, let me check this user's identity, their location, the device health, and everything else against the policies.
Right.
And if everything checks out, then they get access.
But if not,
Then access is denied.
it's pretty cool how it all works together.
It is. And the slide actually does a good job of also explaining the other pieces, like the identity provider,
Okay.
which is Azure AD itself, and it's verifying who the user is.
Okay.
And then you have the device directory, which is validating the device itself.
Got it.
Then there's the policy evaluation engine,
Okay.
which checks if the access request meets all the rules.
Right.
And then finally, the access policy, which actually grants or denies access.
So it's a whole system.
It is, yeah. And it's come a long way from, the early days of identity management.
Right. Right. Speaking of that, slide 4, evolution of identity management.
Yeah.
It shows how things have changed over time, and it's pretty interesting to see.
It is. Like back in the traditional stage, it was all about on-premises systems,
Right.
separate keys for every door, so to speak.
Yeah, and no real visibility into what was going on.
Right. Very limited single sign-on. It was a mess.
And then things started to get a little more sophisticated with cloud federation and conditional access.
Right. That's the advanced stage. We started to get some master keys, some basic security cameras.
Okay.
But now, with Zero Trust, we're moving toward this optimal stage.
Right.
Where it's all about passwordless authentication, real-time analysis of everything.
So it's like instead of a bunch of separate keys, you have one smart lock that recognizes you.
Exactly. And adapts based on the context.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. And that brings us to, the main focus of our discussion today.
Azure AD Privileged Identity Management.
Right. Slide 5. What is privileged identity management?
So PIM.
PM, it's all about protecting those high privilege accounts.
Right, the ones that can really do some damage if they're compromised.
Exactly. The ones that can make big changes to your systems and data.
And the key here is just-in-time access,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
It's not about getting rid of administrator roles altogether.
No. It's about controlling when and how those roles are used.
Okay, so instead of someone having like permanent admin rights,
Right.
they only get them when they need them.
Exactly. And for a limited time.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's about reducing that risk of having those powerful permissions just sitting there waiting to be exploited.
And the slide mentions 3 key benefits of PM: manage, control, and monitor access.
Right.
Just-in-time privileged access,
Yeah.
and mitigating the risk of excessive access.
All those really tie back to that least privilege principle we talked about.
Right, right. So how does PM actually achieve all of that? Slide 6, key features of privileged identity management.
Okay, so let's break down those features. First, you've got just-in-time access,
Right.
which means that when someone needs those elevated privileges, they have to request them.
Okay.
And they're only active for a short period of time.
Like how short are we talking?
It's configurable, but by default, it's somewhere between 1 and 24 hours.
Oh, wow. So it's really temporary.
Yeah, and that's the point. It's like a temporary security clearance badge that expires.
I like that analogy.
Instead of giving someone the master key to the whole building, they just get a badge that lets them into certain areas for a limited time.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's time-bound access, which is about setting specific start and end dates for role assignments.
Okay.
This is especially useful for temporary staff or guest users.
Right, like you don't want them to have access after their project is over.
Exactly. It's like a visitor's pass that only works during their visit.
And then we have approval workflow.
Yeah, this is important.
It means that someone can't just activate those privileges on their own. They need someone else to approve it.
Exactly. It adds another layer of checks and balances.
So it's like a 2-person rule for launching a nuclear missile?
Well, maybe not that extreme, but you get the idea.
Right. It's about making sure that someone isn't acting alone when they're doing something really sensitive.
Exactly.
And then, of course, there's multi-factor authentication.
Which is a must-have these days.
Yeah, it's like needing both a key and a fingerprint to unlock something valuable.
Absolutely. It makes it so much harder for attackers to get in.
Okay, so those are the main features of P.
Yeah. And the slide also mentions a few other things, like requiring justification for the access request, notifications to keep people informed,
Okay.
regular access reviews to make sure privileges are still necessary,
Okay.
And a comprehensive audit history for, if you need to investigate something.
Right, so there's a lot of detail there.
There it is.
But it sounds like PM is pretty customizable, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Slide 7, PM configuration settings, shows you all the different options.
Okay, so let's talk about those settings.
Okay, so there are 3 main categories. You've got activation settings, assignment settings, and notification settings.
Okay, so activation settings, that's about how someone actually activates those privileges.
Right. You can set things like the activation duration,
Okay.
whether MFA is required, if they need to provide a justification, and whether an approval workflow is needed.
So it's like setting the rules for how someone gets those temporary privileges.
Exactly.
And then assignment settings.
That's about who can be assigned to a particular role and for how long.
Okay.
So you can have users who are permanently eligible to activate a role,
Okay.
but they still have to go through that activation process.
Okay.
You can have users who are permanently active, but that should be used very sparingly.
Right. You don't want to give everyone the keys to the kingdom all the time.
Exactly.
And then you can also set specific start and end dates for role assignments.
Right, so someone might only have access for a specific project or a certain amount of time.
Got it. And then notification settings, that's all about who gets notified about what's happening in PM.
Yeah, you can configure notifications for when someone's assigned to a role, when a role is activated, when an approval request is pending, all sorts of things.
Okay, so it sounds like you have a lot of control over who knows what's going on.
You do. And that's important for maintaining visibility and accountability.
Right, right. So let's say someone needs to activate those privileges. Slide 8, elevated access workflow.
Okay.
What does that process look like?
So first, the user initiates a request for access in the Azure portal.
Okay.
Then the system verifies their identity,
Okay.
usually through MFA.
Yeah.
It also checks any conditional access policies that might apply.
Okay.
If everything checks out, then the request goes to the designated approvers.
Okay.
If approval is required.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's approved, then the user gets those privileges.
And only for the specific duration that was set.
Exactly.
So it's a pretty controlled process.
It is. And it's a lot different from just having someone be a permanent administrator.
Right, right. It's like the difference between someone who always has the master key and someone who has to request it every time they need it.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's how you get access. But what about monitoring everything?
Right. Slide 9, monitoring and reporting.
You need to be able to see who has access to what and what they're doing with it.
Absolutely. And Azure provides a bunch of tools for that.
Yeah.
You have the Security Alerts dashboard,
Okay.
which gives you a centralized view of any potential security issues.
So it's like a security control panel that shows you any red flags?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And then you have role assignment reports, which show you who's in each privileged role,
Okay.
both permanently and eligible. So you know who has the keys to the kingdom,
Yeah.
even if they're just temporary.
Right, right. And then access reviews.
Yeah, those are important for making sure that people still need the privileges they have.
Okay.
You can do them periodically to validate that access is still necessary.
So it's like checking in to see if anyone's holding on to a key they don't need anymore.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a lot to take in, but I think we've covered the main points here.
I think so too.
We've talked about how the move to the cloud has shifted the focus to identity as the new perimeter.
Right.
And how Zero Trust is this framework for securing that perimeter through constant verification and least privilege.
Yep.
And then we dove into how Azure AD Privileged Identity Management is a tool for putting that least privilege principle into practice.
Right.
Especially for those really sensitive admin accounts.
And we talked about how important it is to monitor everything that's going on.
Right, you can't just set it and forget it.
No, you need to be vigilant.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, I think the takeaway here is that identity management is more important than ever.
Absolutely. And PI is a powerful tool for getting it right.
Right, it's not just about making things secure, it's also about making sure that your administrators can still do their jobs.
Yeah, it's a balancing act. And that's
Okay.
something I think our listeners should really consider. How do you find that right balance between security and usability?
Right, how do you implement all of this without making things so complicated that people can't get their work done?
Exactly. What are the challenges you might face in your own organization? And what strategies can you use to overcome them?
Those are great questions. I think it's something we all need to be thinking about as we navigate this new world of cloud security.
I agree.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
It was a pleasure being here.